In Unit 2, we're going to start to talk about the development of the staff system. This particular lecture is only going to deal with Chapter 3, but I'm going to give you a brief overview of the other chapters within this unit. If you haven't listened to the introduction and gone through the concepts in Unit 1, you need to understand those concepts before starting this chapter. Especially important is the introduction where I talk about some of the important terms such as interval, scales, transcribe. These are all terms you need to understand before you can begin this chapter. So we'll begin in Chapter 3 with the development of the staff system. In Chapter 4, we're going to talk about the common music clefs that are used to indicate how high or low a pitch should sound. In Chapter 5, we get into the specific notes and pitches and how musicians read them. In Chapter 6, we talk about chromatic notes. And in Chapter 7, we get into the grand staff and pitch notation. Now, if you don't know what any of these concepts mean, that's okay. You'll learn about them through the lecture series and by reading your textbook. In Chapter 8, we get into a very important concept in music known as the overtone series. This series really serves as the basis for our understanding of the creation of scales, chords, and even chord progressions. It determines how composers often decide to voice certain chords, what notes they decide to put in the lowest voice, and what notes they decide to put in the highest voice. So the overtone series is something that, if you have a solid understanding of, it will help you throughout the rest of your life as a musician or an informed listener. So in Chapter 3, we talk about the lines and spaces on the staff system, the modern staff system, notating music, early staff systems, and then an important figure in music known as Guido di Arezzo. Additionally, you'll learn about solfege, church modes, and modern modes. These are all concepts that help lay the groundwork for more advanced study in music. Probably the most important concepts for Chapter 3 include the numbering system for lines and spaces on the staff, the medieval and modern staff systems, Guido di Arezzo and his Guidonian Hand, and the church and modern modes. So it's these concepts that you should be concentrating on specifically while listening to this lecture and reading your textbook. What you see in front of you is a staff system. You'll see that it consists of 5 lines, and then there are spaces in between each one of those lines. We put notes on these lines and spaces to indicate particular pitches that a musician should play. One thing you should note: we number lines and spaces from the bottom to the top, and we number lines and spaces separately. So you wouldn't label the first line as 1 and then the first space as 2. Instead, the first line is 1 and the first space is also 1. That's an important concept, because if I tell you to identify the note on the third line of a particular clef, you'll know what line I'm talking about, or the fourth line would probably be a better example of that. It's important to note that the modern staff system was not always used. Before we had our 5-line staff system, composers and theorists were experimenting with 4 and 6-line systems. There's even a single-line system at one point. And these experimentations continued through the 15th century, even though the 5-line system was first introduced in the 13th century. It took a long time before we actually settled on a 5-line system. Now, in modern music, circular note heads are placed on the staff to indicate how high or low a pitch should sound. So the higher the note is placed, the higher the pitch sounds. So in this example here, we see that line 5 is higher than line 4. So line 5 is going to be a higher pitch than line 4. That's a concept you should understand, because it's important for understanding how to read written music. As a side note, there's a device known as a mosquito, which emits a pitch that plays a high 8 kilohertz pitch. Typically, only teenagers can hear this pitch, so it was used by convenience stores and other shops that wanted to deter loiterers. And tended to work especially well on teenagers because they were the only ones that could actually hear these pitches, these high pitches. As you get older, your ability to hear these high pitches decreases. So adults wouldn't hear it, but kids would, and it would deter them from hanging around outside of the convenience store. When it comes to notating music, there is an entire field of engraving that is devoted to presenting composer scores in the most readable manner possible. However, even if you don't want to become an engraver, you should follow some basic practices when writing your own music or working on exercises at home. When you write notes, the height and width of a note should remain the same no matter where it's written on a staff system. So what that means is all of your notes should maintain the same consistent size, whether it's on a line or a space. When creating staff lines, it's a good idea to use a ruler to maintain a consistent width. You can also just purchase pre-printed staff paper so you don't have to worry about that. That's what most composers will do. In the workbook section, there's actually an entire section devoted to staff paper, so you can download that and print it out on your computer at home if you need some staff paper. Writing notes out by hand helps to create a more in-depth understanding of notes by forcing the attention to each note. This is actually a really important concept because while being able to identify what you see visually on the screen is important, and if you practice the drills available on the website, you'll get better at identifying notes. There's nothing that helps you learn music better than actually hand copying a score or handwriting your notes in the beginning while you're learning these notes. It really creates a connection between you and the note. So I always recommend that all students write everything out by hand whenever possible. You can also use a music notation program, and it can make it easier to create a clean score, but as I said, it's very important to practice writing notes by hand. You really want to develop that connection between the note you're writing, the sound you will eventually start hearing, and the way the note looks on the staff. It's an important concept that will serve you throughout the rest of your musical training. Early staff systems around the 9th century, they didn't use specific pitches. Instead, they only used indicators that kind of gave the idea of the contour of a melody. So what this means is that a lot of musicians in the 9th century, they would simply memorize a piece, and then the music would serve as a reminder of the approximate pitches they had to sing. So it served as a memory tool to help them learn pieces. Originally, our round circular note heads were not used in early music. Instead, they had something known as a neum. Neumes were used to indicate the placement of pitches on staff systems, and there are these small blockish note heads that you can see in the image to your right. Those little boxes are all neumes. So there are a few different types of neumes, and this is something you need to know for your quiz. Simple neumes were a collection of up to 3 pitches. So they'd group 3 pitches together, and if that happened, that was called a simple neum. If you had more than 3 pitches that were grouped together, then it was known as a compound neum. A liquescent neum indicated that the performer should play a passage quietly. It could also indicate performance preferences, such as mood or style. Ornamenting neumes indicated a particular style, but there isn't enough information to know how to perform ornamenting neumes with certainty. So ornamenting neumes are still a bit of a mystery to historians. In early notation, it was primarily used to help musicians memorize music by rote. So that's the important takeaway from all this. You need to know the different types of neumes and how early notation was used in music. So the early 4-line staff system. Before we had the 5-line staff system that became mainstream, a 4-line staff system was experimented with. It's shown here in the example. You see there are 4 red lines, and they often, in important manuals, they would color the music. So it was more for presentation than for the actual singers. So this early medieval score shows an example of the 4-line staff system that was common in medieval music. It was a dominant staff system from the 12th to the 18th centuries. Neumes were always played from the bottom of the staff to the top. In pre-13th century, there was no indication of rhythmic values. The musicians would just learn particular rhythms and patterns and then use the notes as a guide to help them remember the melody. One nice thing about neumes is that they started to indicate exact pitches, so the musicians knew exactly what pitch to play. In 1-line staff systems, which were used in the 11th century, they only provided a general melodic contour like the staff systems of the 9th century. And with these 1-line staff systems, or general staff systems we can call them, the notes increased in pitch the higher they are placed. 4, 5, and 6-line staff systems were used throughout the 17th century, and the 5-line staff system created in the 13th century eventually gained prominence when we got into the 18th and 19th centuries. The important thing to know here is that there wasn't always simply a 5-line staff system. It took a long time to develop our modern system of notation. And one of the people who's responsible for our development of music is a man named Guido di Arezzo. He's nicknamed the father of modern music by several writers of the 15th and 16th centuries. And that's a pretty good title considering everything that he did. He was born around 991 to 992 AD in a small town in Arezzo, Italy. He died in about 1033. Now, we don't know the exact date that he died, but based on some of his publications and some other historical facts, most historians will put his death at about 1033. So you may find some differing information online, and the truth is we don't know an exact date of death. But we're pretty certain he was born around 991 992. He started his musical career at a Benedictine monastery in Pomposa, Italy. He became very well known at this monastery, and there's some indication that there's a little bit of jealousy and animosity towards him. He eventually did leave, however, and when he left, that's when he really was able to spread his musical ideas and become more widely known. So he didn't name himself the father of modern music. It was a name given by other writers on music who lived during the 15th and 16th centuries. He was a teacher, theorist, and music director, and he made the 4-line staff system popular, but it's important to note that he didn't create it. It already existed. He just refined it and made it a more effective system for musicians to use. And one of the things that he did was he used precise notation where the position of the note on the staff indicated the note and an exact pitch instead of a general melodic contour. One of his most famous textbooks is called Micrologus, and it was written in 1026. It includes much of the information about his contributions. And Micrologus is actually one of the reasons why we know approximately when he was born and approximately when he died. One of his most important contributions is solfege. He created the solfege system, and it's one form that is still used today. There are many forms of solfege. There's chromatic solfege, fixed dose solfege, movable dose solfege, and then within chromatic solfege, there's several different schools of thought on how chromatic solfege should be created. So for this course, we use fixed dose solfege, which means that every time you see a particular note, it's going to have the same solfege. But we'll talk more about solfege in a minute. So Guido's 4-line staff system. Important things to know. It was developed in approximately 1025 AD. The second line of the staff system was often colored red. It indicated the note F. Remember that in the staff system, we have specific names for every line. So rather than saying line 1 or line 2, depending on the clef, we actually have a letter name to indicate the specific note that falls on that line. So this is what this is referring to. The second line of the staff system from the bottom. So you got your first staff, you've got your first staff line, then your second staff line. It was colored red and it indicated the note F. The fourth, the top line of the staff system, was colored yellow and it indicated the note C. This just happens to be an interval of a perfect fifth, which you haven't learned about yet. But as you study music, you're going to learn the perfect fifth is a very important interval. And it's also the first interval in your daily routine if you're practicing that at home. The first line was often colored blue, and the third line was colored black. And those lines represented the notes D and A. Not a lot of people know that, but every line could actually be colored. In a lot of scores, only the second and the fourth line maintained their coloring. But in fully produced scores, you also had a blue and a black line. So the interval distance between the red and the yellow line is a perfect fifth, as I've said, and you're going to find out why that is so important when we begin to talk about the overtone series in chapter 8. Next thing we're going to talk about is solfege. So solfege is something that's very important when you're trying to learn to sing music. Solfege provides a simple way of singing easily pronounced syllables instead of singing letter names, or if you don't have lyrics to sing. So instead of singing the note C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, you can sing Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Do. Guido's solfege differs from our solfege, and mainly by the first syllable and the last syllable. You'll see here that Guido's solfege uses the words Ut, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La. There's no T, and Ut is Ut instead of Do. In the modern system, on the first scale degree, the first solfege, we would call that Do. And then we have one more after La called T. It's not that he didn't understand that there was a T in the system. They just didn't really use that syllable in his time period. That note was considered to be highly dissonant and problematic, so it often wasn't used. So solfege is believed to be based on a poem written to honor John the Baptist. The poem was likely written by Paul the Deacon, although historians do differ on this, and it's still a point of contention. So just know that that information could change in the future. The poem uses a sapphic stanza form named for the Greek poet Sappho. It's unclear if Guido composed the music himself. Now, there's actually a picture right there of Sappho. She was a woman and very famous in her time for creating poetry. The full text of the poem that is believed to be used is to your right, along with the notation that is probably most accurate for the original solfege. One thing you'll notice is that, which we'll talk about in the next slide, but each syllable of Guido's solfege is actually listed in the music to your right. And I'll show you that in more detail in the next slide. So our modern solfege uses the syllables Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti. Some universities and some schools will use C instead of T. This is fine if you're using fixed Do, but once you start to get into chromatic solfege, then often the last syllable will be T, and that's because C has to be used for one of the chromatic solfege pitches. But the important thing to know is there are variations on modern solfege. Fixed Do simply assigns specific solfege to individual notes, so they never change. No matter whether you have a C or a C sharp, all C's are going to be the note do. They'll all use a syllable do. All D's will use re, all E's will use mi, all F's will use fa, all G's will use so, all A's will use la, and all B's will use T or C, depending on the system. Movable do permits the solfege syllables to change relative to the piece. Now this is a more advanced concept, and in order to understand how movable do works, you first need to understand key signatures. So we don't talk about movable do in this course until the very end. So if you look at the poem, the first syllable for each line of the poem is used to create the solfege and Guido system. So on the first line, you have ut, and then about halfway through, you have the next syllable, re. On the second line, you have mi, and then about halfway through, you have fa. Then you have so on the third line, and la. There is no T, as you can see, but all these syllables are taken from the first word of each phrase. And this just kind of gives you an idea of where solfege came from. So it's not completely randomly selected syllables. And this note down here, it says the final solfege syllable isn't used. The first letter of each word spells C. This could be where a modern solfege, T and C, originated from. So if you look at the last two words, Sancte Johannes, originally that Johannes was spelled with an I because they didn't have the letter J yet. It hadn't been created. So they used the letter I, and it sounded like Johannes. So that SI could very well be where C comes from. A lot of historians seem to believe that to be the case. An important tool that Guido used was a Guidonian hand. Now you see all these numbers on the hand. Each one of those numbers refers to a particular segment on the hand. So what Guido could do is he could point to segments of his hand in front of a large choir, and the singers would then sing a particular sequence of notes based on where he was pointing. And you'll see how it goes all the way up to the number 20. 20 is actually right above the middle finger. So it makes it easier to learn new pieces since the hand could use a melody of an existing work to teach singers. And often the actual pitches used could change, but it was based on an existing piece, and he'd tell the performers this section here is 1, 2, 3, and then the performers would just know how to sing. You don't have to learn how to use the Guidonian hand. You simply need to know that it existed and that it was a teaching tool to teach a large choir how to sing a new piece of music. And this was kind of revolutionary at the time because it made it possible to teach new music very, very quickly. So the church modes. They were used before the system of major and minor scales were created. And actually, there are two church modes that correlate to a major and a minor scale that we have today. Church modes are sometimes called medieval or Gregorian modes, but since they are mainly used in the church, a lot of musicians refer to them as church modes. They can be identified by the starting pitch of the mode where no accidentals, including sharps or flats, are used. So you haven't yet learned about accidentals, but the bottom line here is if you go to a piano keyboard, the church modes would use only white keys. So the first mode might start on C. The second mode would start on D, and it would go up to D. The third mode would start on E and go up to E. The fourth mode would start on F to F. And there are also particular names for each one of these modes. Initially, only 8 of the modes were used. Henry of Glaris, a Swiss monk, added 4 additional modes later on. These modes are documented in a 1547 text known as Dodecacordon. It's an important text. It really lets us know where the concept of these modes came from, and it talks a lot about music theory of a more ancient time. So modes can be played easily using the white keys of the piano, as I've already explained. The first mode starts and ends on C, the second mode starts and ends on D, the third mode starts and ends on E. And we have these different modes because each mode has its own unique sound due to the positioning of the half steps and whole steps in the mode. So if you remember your piano keyboard, there's a set of double set of black keys and a triple set of black keys. Because of that unique configuration, some modes will consist of a different sequence of half steps and whole steps, and that changes the way it sounds. One mode that was never used in the 16th century is a mode called Locrian, and that's because there's actually a tritone, which is something you'll learn about later on. It was known as the devil's interval, between the first scale degree and the fifth scale degree. And for structural reasons, the first and the fifth scale degree could not be modified. So rather than dealing with this really dissonant sounding interval, we just completely said we're not going to use Locrian at all. It just wasn't used. And there's a note here about where a mode can be identified by the starting pitch of the mode and that no accidentals or sharps are used. There is one mode where this doesn't apply to. The Lydian mode is actually the fourth mode. It starts on F. The fourth degree of that mode is sometimes made flat to avoid the tritone between the first and fourth degrees. So in Locrian we couldn't use it because it was between the first and fifth, which is, if you remember earlier, I told you the perfect fifth is an important interval. With Lydian, since it's between the first and the fourth, it's okay to change the fourth because it's not structurally an important interval. If any of this talk about structure and flats and sharps and accidentals is complicated or confusing to you, the good news is all you need to know right now is that there's a thing called church modes, and they don't use any accidentals. They just use the white keys of the piano, and depending on the note that they start on, whether it's C, D, E, F, G, A, or B. So now we're going to talk about the modern modes. This course only focuses on the modern modes. It's useful to know the church modes as a concept, that they existed before the modern modes and that our modern modes are based on the church modes. But the church modes are actually a much more complicated concept that we don't have to get into in an introductory course like this. So the modern modes were formulated by the 11th century. There are 7 modes that are currently used in the Western system. In the original church mode system, there's actually many more than 7. Henry of Glaris actually named the modes incorrectly after what he believed to be their original Greek names. The ancient Greek modes are actually not related to the modern modes or even the church modes for that matter. They were a completely different system. So he thought he was sort of resurrecting the old ancient Greek system of modal scales, but he in fact wasn't. However, he named the modes in one of his famous treatises, and the names have stuck. So now for the modern modes, we have Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. And those are the modes that you're concerned with. The last mode, Locrian, was actually never used in the 16th century, and that's because there's actually a really harsh distance between 2 very important scale degrees or modal degrees in the system. Between the first and the fifth mode degree, you actually have something known as a tritone, which creates a dissonance that can't be resolved because of the importance of the first and the fifth mode degree. So what you see here, if you look at Ionian, you see in C, it's in parentheses. That tells you that Ionian starts on the note C. So if you go to a piano and you hit the note C, you'll be able to play an Ionian mode if you play all the notes from C up to the next C. So I'm going to actually play you a recording of what Ionian would sound like. It's actually our major scale. Sounds exactly the same. The next mode is Dorian. It would start on the next note up, D. Then you've got Phrygian on E. Then you have Lydian on F. Then you've got Mixolydian on G. And then you have Aeolian on A. And then Locrian on B. Now you're going to hear there's actually 8 notes there, but there's only 7 unique notes because the first and last scale degree are actually repeated. So what you're seeing here, if you remember the piano layout, the piano consists of a double set of black keys and a triple set of black keys. The double set of black keys and the triple set allow for half steps in between the white notes. But if you just start on the note C for Ionian and you go up what we call one whole step from the root of the mode, that's what the R stands for in this illustration, then you've started your path towards playing an Ionian scale. So what the W stands for is a whole step, and the H stands for a half step. And all this illustration is showing you between the different modes is that each mode has a unique combination of half steps and whole steps. And you can check that. You'll see that no 2 modes have the same exact system of half steps and whole steps. That's what makes each one sound unique. It's the half steps that allow them to maintain their own unique character. So this is what the modes look like if you write them out on a staff system. You'll notice that Ionian has a line through it on that bottom note. We actually call that note middle C. It's an important note. You're going to be learning about it when we discuss notes in a later chapter. But the important thing here is to notice, even if you don't understand how to read music yet, you can see that Ionian starts on C and then moves to D. Then that D in the Ionian scale, in what we would call the second measure, that's where Dorian starts. So then Dorian goes from D up to D. If you look at the next note of Dorian, you've got an E, that's where Phrygian starts, and then Lydian starts a note above that, Mixolydian a note above that, Aeolian starts on the A above that, and Aeolian is actually our minor scale, and Locrian starts above that. So there are 2 scales here that really matter. The Ionian and Aeolian are the basis for our major in Ionian and natural minor in Aeolian scales. This is where they came from. And if you look at the Lydian scale, if I were to play this scale again, listen for the 4th scale degree and its relationship to the 1st scale degree, and see if you can hear why something special has to happen with this scale, with this mode in most cases. If you have really sensitive ears, you'll hear that the F and the B, which is the 4th note in the Lydian scale, it creates a dissonant interval, and these dissonant intervals have to be resolved. So they didn't like the dissonance in the medieval period, so one of the solutions is to just lower that B by a half step. So you end up playing a black key right below B. So now we have a more consonant sounding interval, and if I play it, it sounds just like the Ionian scale. That is the same in terms of half steps and whole steps as Ionian. There's another scale with a problem in it. We can change Lydian because the 4th scale degree doesn't really have an effect on the structure of the scale, so it's okay to change that. With the Locrian, you've got another tritone. It actually happens between the 1st and the 5th scale degree. And this causes a problem that can't be fixed by simply changing the notes. So I'll let you listen to it. So if you listen, you'll hear that tritone between the 1st and the 5th. And because the tritone happens on the 1st scale degree, which determines the mode, and the fifth scale degree, which is important for structural reasons. You can't change either of those notes. You can change the fourth scale degree in Lydian, because the fourth scale degree, while important, it isn't an absolutely essential note to have in the scale. And this is something that if you get into chord progressions, you'll start to understand why they couldn't use Locrian in the 16th century. It just caused some dissonances and they weren't able to resolve it. So they just didn't use it altogether. So that's everything you need to know for chapter 3. We'll be getting into some more advanced concepts in the other chapters, and then we'll start learning more about how music is actually created and how to read and write music.